The night my mother died, the house did not cry with us. It listened, every wall memorizing what the living tried to forget, because grief does not always scream, sometimes it waits. And that was the night I learned that silence can be sharper than knives, sharper than betrayal, sharper than blood. Because while everyone believed her death was the end of a weak woman broken by illness, I saw something else in her final breath. A warning, a promise, a story, unfinished. And if you stay till the end of this video, you will understand why some families do not break. They rot from the inside. So before this story pulls you deeper, make sure you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from, because stories like this are not told twice, they are survived once. My mother was buried before sunrise, wrapped in white, her face peaceful in a way life never allowed her, and as soil fell on her grave, my father stood beside me with dry eyes, already planning his next chapter, because grief was never his weakness, control was, and the moment he realized there was no one left to question him, something in his posture changed, like a king reclaiming a throne he believed was stolen from him by duty and appearances. And I noticed it because children who grow up in emotional war zones learn to read body language better than books. Our family was respected in the city, not loved, respected. The kind of respect that comes from fear disguised as success. My grandfather had built it, my father inherited it, and my mother was the cost it demanded. A woman who gave up her voice so her children could keep their surname clean, and for years I believed she was weak, until I found the truth hidden in an old steel trunk the night after her funeral, when the house was quiet and the air smelled like incense and unspoken relief. The trunk was locked, but grief gives strength to hands that shake, and when it opened, I did not find jewelry or memories. I found files, letters, bank statements, and a diary written in a handwriting that trembled but never broke, page after page revealing a woman who had been collecting evidence against her own family, not out of hatred, but preparation, because she knew one day she would not be there to protect us, and someone else would have to finish what she started. I sat on the floor until morning, reading how my father had manipulated property transfers, forged signatures, emotionally destroyed my elder sister until she left home and was erased from family records. How my uncle had stolen my mother's inheritance under the excuse of tradition, and how everyone smiled in public while bleeding her in private, and the final page ended with a sentence that burned itself into my bones. If you are reading this, they think I am gone. Use that belief. The next morning I looked at my father across the breakfast table, and saw him for what he truly was, a man who believed victory came from outliving witnesses, and I smiled at him the way my mother used to, soft, obedient, invisible, and he smiled back, unaware that the person he feared the least had just inherited the most dangerous thing in our family, the truth. Over the next few weeks, I played my role perfectly, mourning child, quiet, grateful, staying close, asking nothing, learning everything, because revenge does not rush, it studies. I listened when my father spoke to lawyers on the phone. I memorized names when my uncle visited to discuss business matters that were never meant for my ears. I observed how money moved like blood through our family veins, and where it could be blocked without anyone realizing they were bleeding. My sister returned quietly after years of silence, invited back not by love but by opportunity. Because my father believed broken people were easier to control, and when I hugged her at the door, I felt how fragile she was, and how much rage lived under that fragility. But I said nothing, because timing matters more than emotion. I showed her the diary in secret, watched her hands shake the way mine had, and for the first time in years, we cried together not from pain, but from understanding, because the moment you see the enemy clearly, fear begins to die. Our plan was never loud, never dramatic, it was precise, legal, and slow, like poison mixed into routine. My sister reclaimed her identity by reopening old academic records my father had buried, proving he had lied about her mental stability to remove her from inheritance eligibility, while I used my mother's documents to anonymously tip financial authorities about irregularities that forced audits without revealing their source. And my uncle, arrogant and careless, started panicking when accounts he believed untouchable were frozen for investigation, turning on my father in whispered accusations, because loyalty built on greed collapses under pressure. At home, nothing changed on the surface. Dinners continued, laughter was practiced, prayers were recited, but beneath it all, the foundation was cracking, and I could see it in my father's eyes when he realized control was slipping through fingers he believed were closed fists. Yet he still underestimated the danger, because he thought revenge required anger, and we were calm. The first visible crack came when a court notice arrived, questioning ownership of ancestral property, something my father had always bragged was secured forever, and I watched his hands tremble for the first time as he read it, the same hands that had signed papers, stealing my mother's life piece by piece, and that night he drank alone, unaware that the very documents he used to control us were now his cage. What he never considered was that my mother had taught us patience, not obedience, and patience is lethal when paired with truth. and as the city slowly turned its gaze toward our family with curiosity instead of admiration, I stood by his side publicly, defending him, comforting him, becoming the shield he never knew was made of glass. Because the most effective revenge does not come from attack, it comes from letting someone destroy themselves while believing they are being saved. The weeks that followed did not explode, they tightened, like a rope pulled slowly, until the person standing in the middle forgets when breathing became difficult, because fear grows quietly when it believes it is alone. And my father believed he was still the center of everything, still the man everyone depended on. Yet every decision he made began to echo back with resistance he could not locate. Lawyers started delaying responses with polite professionalism. Business partners asked questions they never asked before. Relatives stopped answering calls at night, and the house that once obeyed his footsteps now felt unfamiliar to him, while to me it felt like a stage finally prepared for the truth to walk onto it without permission. I stayed close to him, close enough to hear the tremor in his voice when he spoke to accountants, close enough to notice how he reread the same document again and again, as if repetition could change reality, and close enough to learn that power is not lost in one moment, it leaks, drop by drop, until the person who owned the ocean panics at the sound of an empty glass. My sister worked in silence, rebuilding her life like someone assembling a weapon piece by piece, attending hearings, filing affidavits, confronting records that had been altered years ago, not with anger but with facts so precise they left no room for interpretation. And when officials asked her why she waited so long, she simply said she was told she had no voice, and that sentence alone shifted rooms in her favor, because truth does not shout. It sits down and waits for everyone else to lie first. Meanwhile, my uncle made the mistake greedy men always make when pressure rises. He talked too much, and every conversation he had in confidence found its way back to us through the channels my mother had quietly prepared long before we understood why, because she trusted systems more than people, and systems do not feel guilt when they expose corruption. One afternoon my father came home early, his face pale, his confidence leaking through clenched teeth as he announced that a temporary hold had been placed on multiple assets, pending review, calling it a misunderstanding, calling it routine, calling it nothing to worry about. And I nodded like the child he believed I was, while inside I counted how many walls had just collapsed without making a sound. At dinner that night he spoke of loyalty, of family unity, of enemies who wanted to destroy us, and I watched how carefully he avoided names, because naming the threat would have required admitting he no longer controlled it. And when he raised a glass to honor my mother's memory, something inside me hardened, because he spoke of her sacrifice as if it was a natural disaster. Unavoidable, tragic, but no one's fault. And in that moment I understood that men like him never see themselves as villains, only as survivors who happened to step on others to stay alive. The city began whispering, not loudly, but enough for doors to open slower, smiles to last shorter, and invitations to quietly disappear. And that was when my father panic shifted into paranoia, questioning staff, accusing relatives, rewriting history in real time to protect his image, because reputation was the last thing he believed could still save him. And watching him unravel taught me something my mother never wrote down, that control is not strength, it is dependency, and once broken it leaves nothing underneath. The turning point came disguised as opportunity, a proposal from a development firm interested in ancestral land my father had illegally consolidated under his name years ago, believing time would erase the method, and he saw the offer as salvation, a way to convert frozen assets into clean money, and without hesitation he agreed, unaware that the land records attached to the deal were already under scrutiny, and that any transaction would trigger a deeper investigation that could not be stopped once begun. My sister warned him gently, suggesting caution, playing the role of a daughter, seeking approval, and he dismissed her with the same arrogance that destroyed her years ago, proving that men who never learn repeat their cruelty. Thinking experience has turned it into wisdom. When authorities arrived, it was quiet, respectful, procedural, no handcuffs, no shouting, just questions layered so carefully they trapped him inside his own answers. And I watched as he tried to outthink a system that no longer feared his name, and for the first time I saw him small, not physically, but spiritually, a man who had lived his life above consequence, suddenly forced to acknowledge gravity. The house filled with tension that could not be prayed away. Phones rang unanswered. Rooms felt heavier, and my father began pacing at night like a caged animal, replaying conversations, suspecting everyone, including me, yet never quite allowing himself to believe that the child he underestimated had inherited the patience of the woman he destroyed. My uncle attempted escape, shifting blame, offering deals, sacrificing loyalty in exchange for safety. But corruption does not negotiate clean exits. It documents everything, and the more he spoke, the deeper he sank, dragging my father's name with him into records that would never be erased, because paper remembers longer than people do. One evening my father confronted me, his voice calm but eyes searching, asking if I had noticed anything strange, if I had heard rumors, if I knew who might be behind the sudden storm surrounding him, and I looked at him the way he once looked at my mother, with false concern and practiced innocence, telling him storms happen without reason sometimes, and he nodded slowly, unconvinced but exhausted, because suspicion without proof eats the mind alive. As days turned into weeks, the mask he wore for the world cracked further, arguments erupted at family gatherings, alliances shattered publicly, and the respect that once protected him now watched silently as he burned, because society forgives success built on cruelty only while it succeeds, and once it fails, morality returns like a judge who never forgot the case. Through it all, I remained steady, grounded by the knowledge that revenge fueled by chaos collapses, but revenge guided by logic closes every exit. And when my sister finally won partial restoration of her rights, the ruling read like poetry written by law, stating that manipulation, coercion, and deception had robbed her of years she would never get back, and the responsibility lay clearly where it always belonged. My father did not attend the hearing, claiming illness, but I knew the truth. He could not face a room where control had shifted and the narrative no longer belonged to him. And when he returned home that night, he did not speak. He sat alone in the dark living room, surrounded by furniture bought with stolen peace. And for the first time since my mother's death, I felt no anger, only clarity, because watching someone realize too late that they built their empire on borrowed time is not satisfying, it is sobering. The final blow was approaching, not dramatic, not violent, but inevitable. And as I stood at the window watching city lights flicker like distant witnesses, I understood why my mother waited, why she endured, why she documented instead of escaping, because she knew that true revenge is not about destruction, it is about exposure. And once the truth is seen clearly, there is no place left to hide. By the time winter settled into the city, the cold had moved indoors, not into the walls, but into relationships that once pretended to be warm. And my father began losing allies faster than assets, because people who once benefited from his shadows suddenly remembered the sun, and they stepped away carefully, as if distance could erase memory, while he sat at the center of a shrinking circle, convincing himself this was temporary, that storms pass, that power always returns to those patient enough to wait. But patience without leverage is just waiting to fall. Legal notices arrived in steady rhythm, each one polite, precise, and merciless, outlining discrepancies that could no longer be explained away by influence or charm. And I watched him age in weeks the way others age in decades, his hair thinning, his voice roughening, his authority cracking every time someone addressed him without fear, because respect forced is fragile, and once cracked it never fully returns. My sister moved back into the house officially, not as a defeated child seeking shelter, but as a legal heir reclaiming space, and every step she took through those hallways was a quiet rebellion, a reminder of years erased by lies, now stitched back together by truth. And my father tried to tolerate her presence, telling himself control could still be reasserted, unaware that control over a narrative is lost the moment witnesses begin speaking freely. At night he reviewed old documents, rewriting events in his head, searching for a moment he could undo, a decision he could blame, but regret never offers solutions, it only sharpens awareness, and awareness came too late for a man who spent his life avoiding it. The investigation expanded, not because we pushed it, but because corruption attracts attention once it is exposed. And every account examined revealed another, every signature questioned led to more, like a thread pulled from a sleeve unraveling an entire garment, and the deeper it went, the clearer my mother's preparation became, because she did not aim to destroy quickly, she aimed to make collapse unavoidable. Relatives who once praised my father's strength now visited with concern masked as advice, urging settlements, compromises, quiet resolutions, but he heard only betrayal, because men who rule through fear interpret caution as disloyalty. And with every accusation he pushed people further away, isolating himself inside a fortress built from suspicion. One evening my uncle arrived unannounced, desperation written across his face, offering my father a deal, suggesting they shift blame toward a deceased accountant, a convenient ghost unable to defend himself, and I watched my father consider it, not because it was right, but because it offered escape, and that moment revealed the final truth about him, that even at the edge of collapse he was willing to bury someone else to save himself, just as he buried my mother's dignity to preserve his image. My sister listened quietly, then asked a single question that ended the conversation, asking whether lying again would change anything. And the silence that followed was heavier than any argument, because no one could answer honestly without admitting defeat. The city press began circling, not aggressively, but with curiosity sharpened by documentation. And when my father's name appeared in headlines without honor, stripped of reverence, reduced to facts, he realized reputation does not die dramatically, it fades, and fading is unbearable to those who built their identity on being seen. At home he began lashing out, not violently, but verbally, rewriting history aloud, blaming my mother's illness for misunderstandings, accusing my sister of ingratitude, accusing me of distance, unaware that every word he spoke confirmed the story that documents already told, because when lies are exposed, behavior becomes evidence. I remained calm, not cold, but distant, offering assistance when asked, silence when accused, because reacting emotionally would have given him something to fight. And I understood that the absence of resistance is sometimes the most effective form of control, forcing the other person to confront themselves without distraction. The legal machinery moved forward steadily, hearings scheduled, testimonies recorded, and when my father was summoned to provide formal statements, he prepared obsessively, rehearsing answers, constructing explanations layered enough to confuse, but complexity does not defeat clarity, and every attempt to obscure only highlighted intent. During one deposition, when asked why certain properties were transferred without consent, he spoke of tradition, authority, necessity, and the room listened politely, before reminding him that tradition does not override law, authority does not erase consent, and necessity does not justify deception. And I saw his shoulders slump slightly, because excuses that once worked in private mean nothing under public scrutiny. The house itself seemed to reject him now, creaking at night, lights flickering unexpectedly, mirrors reflecting a man he barely recognized, and though superstition tempted him, he could not escape the rational truth that collapse feels supernatural only to those who never believed it possible. My sister and I spoke often, not about revenge, but about recovery, about the years stolen from her, the childhood manipulated from me, the cost my mother paid quietly, and those conversations grounded us, reminding us that the purpose was never punishment, it was correction, restoring balance to a story distorted by power. When my uncle was formally charged, he attempted reconciliation, apologizing, blaming influence, pleading for unity, but unity built on shared guilt offers no comfort, and his desperation only reinforced the narrative of a family that protected itself at the expense of its most vulnerable member. My father's health declined under stress, not dramatically, but noticeably, fatigue setting into his movements, breath shortening, hands trembling when he poured tea, and though part of me felt sympathy, it was tempered by memory. Because compassion does not require forgetting, and forgiveness without accountability is just surrender. The day arrived when my father's assets were officially seized pending final judgment, and he sat at the dining table staring at papers that confirmed what he had avoided admitting. That control was gone, decisions now made by people immune to his influence, and for the first time he asked a question without accusation, asking how things reached this point, and I answered truthfully, telling him they reached this point the moment he chose power over people, and silence followed, not defensive, but hollow. That night I walked through the house, remembering my mother's footsteps, her quiet endurance, her careful documentation, and I realized she never wanted revenge fueled by anger. She wanted resolution anchored in truth, a future where her children did not inherit fear disguised as loyalty. And standing there I felt both the weight of her absence and the strength of her foresight. The final chapter was approaching, not with chaos, but with order. And as the city prepared to witness the conclusion of a story it once admired from afar, I understood that endings do not always come with satisfaction. Sometimes they arrive with understanding, and understanding, once achieved, cannot be undone. The final stretch did not announce itself with drama, it arrived quietly, the way truth always does when it no longer needs permission, and my father sensed it before anyone said a word, waking earlier each day, sitting longer in silence, his mind replaying a lifetime of decisions, now stripped of their justifications, because when excuses fall away, intention stands naked, and intention is hard to look at without flinching. The court date was set, not rushed, not delayed, simply placed into the calendar of a system that had finally caught up with him, and the days leading to it felt suspended, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to exhale a history it had been forced to contain for decades. Relatives stopped visiting altogether, calls went unanswered, and the man who once commanded rooms now moved through empty spaces, speaking only when necessary, conserving words as if silence could shield him from consequence. My sister prepared meticulously, not with bitterness, but with precision, reviewing records, timelines, testimonies, because she understood that this moment was not about emotion, it was about restoration, reclaiming years stolen through manipulation disguised as care. And watching her, I realized how survival reshapes people, not always into something hard, sometimes into something unbreakably clear. On the morning of the hearing, my father dressed carefully, choosing a suit that once symbolized authority, straightening his tie with hands that betrayed him, and as we left the house together, he paused at the door, looking back as if trying to memorize a version of himself that would never return. Because buildings remember who lived honestly within them, and ours remembered everything. The courtroom was calm, structured, indifferent to personal history, and that indifference unsettled him more than hostility ever could, because he could not negotiate with neutrality. He could not charm procedure, and as proceedings began, his narrative was dismantled piece by piece, not by accusation, but by evidence that spoke without anger. Documents my mother preserved years ago were presented, timelines aligned, signatures compared, patterns revealed, and with each revelation, the story he told himself collapsed further, replaced by a reality he could no longer rewrite. When my sister testified, she did not cry, she did not accuse, she simply described events as they occurred. Her voice steady, her words measured, and the power of her testimony came from restraint, because truth delivered without aggression is impossible to dismiss as exaggeration. My father listened, his face unreadable, but his body told the story. His mouth refused to admit, shoulders sinking, jaw tightening, eyes avoiding contact, because denial requires energy, and he had spent it all maintaining control for years. When asked to respond, he spoke of intention, of responsibility, of cultural expectations, repeating arguments that once worked in private spaces, but under examination they sounded hollow, detached from consequence, and the court acknowledged his words before moving on, because acknowledgement is not agreement, and the difference between the two is where power changes hands. The ruling was comprehensive, not vindictive, outlining accountability, restitution, and loss of authority, and as it was read aloud, I felt no triumph, only a profound stillness, because the conclusion of injustice does not feel like victory, it feels like gravity, restoring balance. My father was ordered to relinquish control over assets, properties were reassigned, legal responsibility established, and the structure he built to protect himself was repurposed to correct what it concealed. And in that moment I understood that systems, when they work, do not punish, they realign. Leaving the courtroom, my father did not speak, his gaze fixed ahead, his walk slower, and for the first time I saw him not as a villain, not as a victim, but as a man facing the consequences of his own philosophy, a philosophy that valued power over empathy, control over connection, and it had delivered exactly what it promised: isolation. At home that evening, the house felt different, lighter, not because pain was gone, but because truth had been acknowledged, and acknowledgement lifts weight that silence cannot. My sister moved through rooms with a quiet confidence, not claiming dominance, but reclaiming presence, and watching her, I realized that restoration is not about returning to what was, it is about creating what should have been allowed to exist from the beginning. My father retreated into himself, not dramatically, but inwardly, spending hours alone, reading old files, letters, remnants of a life built on strategic decisions, and one night, he approached me, his voice softer than I had ever heard it, asking why we did not confront him directly, why we chose this path instead of accusation, and I answered honestly, telling him confrontation invites defense, but truth, when documented and patient, invites inevitability, and inevitability does not argue, it concludes. He nodded slowly, absorbing words that arrived decades too late, and in that moment I felt something unexpected, not forgiveness, but release, because holding anger requires connection, and I no longer needed one built on pain. Weeks passed, adjustments were made, assets reorganized, responsibilities reassigned, and life continued, not unchanged, but corrected. And I began to understand that revenge, when stripped of cruelty, becomes accountability, and accountability, when accepted, becomes education. My father's health stabilized once the battle ended, not because he won, but because resistance ceased. And though our relationship remained distant, it was honest in a way it never had been, free from manipulation, stripped of expectation, and that honesty, though quiet, was real. I often thought of my mother during those days, her patience, her foresight, her refusal to become cruel even when cruelty surrounded her, and I realized that her greatest act of revenge was not exposure. It was teaching us that dignity does not require dominance, and strength does not require silence. As the city moved on, headlines fading, attention shifting, our family settled into a new reality, one built on transparency rather than fear, and while scars remained, they no longer dictated behavior. Standing in the same house where my mother once endured quietly, I felt her presence not as absence, but as foundation, and I understood that emotional family revenge does not end with destruction, it ends with clarity, and clarity, once achieved, becomes a legacy no one can steal. Time did not heal our family in the way people like to promise, it reshaped it, carving away illusions until only what was real remained. And in that reshaping I learned that endings are rarely loud, they are lived into quietly, day by day, choice by choice, until one morning you wake up and realize the story that once controlled you no longer has authority over your breath. Months after the judgment, the house no longer felt like a battlefield or a courtroom. It felt like a place learning how to exist without fear, Rooms reclaimed their purpose. Laughter returned cautiously, not forced, not performative, but genuine, in small moments that did not ask permission from the past. My sister took over responsibilities she had once been denied, not with hunger for power, but with intention. Restructuring what had been misused, ensuring transparency where secrecy once thrived. And watching her lead with steadiness taught me that leadership born from pain carries empathy that authority inherited never learns. My father remained physically present, but spiritually distant, no longer issuing commands, no longer shaping narratives, moving through the days with an awareness that came too late to change history but early enough to prevent further harm. And though some might call that mercy, I understood it as consequence, because living with clarity after years of denial is its own sentence. We spoke occasionally, not about blame, not about forgiveness, but about practicalities, boundaries, and unspoken understanding that the roles we once played could never be revived. And in that honesty there was a strange peace, because false harmony is louder than conflict, and now there was neither. One afternoon I found my mother diary again, its pages worn from rereading, and for the first time I noticed something I missed before, a line tucked between evidence and dates, a sentence written not for justice, but for us, saying, "Do not let survival make you cruel." And it struck me that her true fear was not what would happen to those who wronged her, but what prolonged injustice might turn her children into. That realization reframed everything. The patience, the preparation, the refusal to confront emotionally. She was not planning revenge. She was preserving our humanity while ensuring truth would stand on its own. The city eventually forgot the scandal, as cities always do, attention shifting to newer stories, louder collapses, but our lives did not forget. They integrated the lesson quietly, choosing transparency over tradition, conversation over control, and accountability over silence. Family gatherings changed, smaller, simpler, stripped of hierarchy, and while some relatives never returned, others came back cautiously, learning that access now required honesty, not obedience, and that shift alone felt revolutionary. My father watched these changes from the edge, sometimes with regret, sometimes with resignation, and once, in a moment of rare vulnerability, he admitted that power had always felt safer than love, because love required listening, and listening risked exposure. And though his admission did not erase the past, it closed a door that had remained open too long, the door of denial. I did not respond with reassurance. I did not argue. I simply acknowledged his words. Because growth does not require applause, it requires recognition, and recognition does not need to be loud. As years passed, the story transformed from something we survived into something we understood. And understanding is where healing actually begins, not at the moment of justice, but in the quiet acceptance of what will never be changed and what can still be shaped. I pursued my own path beyond the family structure, carrying lessons rather than resentment, and whenever I faced choices that tempted me toward control, toward silence, toward convenience at the cost of truth, I remembered my mother patience, my sister resilience, and the cost my father paid for choosing power over empathy. Revenge stories often promise satisfaction through destruction, but this one ended differently. It ended with restoration that did not glorify pain, with accountability that did not require cruelty, and with a family that learned too late, but not entirely too late, that love cannot survive where fear is used as glue. The house still stands, altered but honest, and sometimes when sunlight hits the hallway just right, I imagine my mother walking through it freely for the first time, no longer documenting, no longer enduring, simply existing. And that image alone feels like justice completed. If this story held you until the end, if it made you feel something beyond anger or satisfaction, then like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment what part stayed with you the most, because stories like this live on only when they are shared. And truth, once spoken, deserves witnesses.